When four men threaten Eleanor Davis on a quiet street, she doesn't back down. With her loyal dog and unshakable strength, she sparks a powerful fight for justice. Watch how. Eleanor Davis had always believed that strength didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and unyielding, like the roots of an ancient oak tree. That afternoon, as the late sun bathed her suburban neighborhood in warm hues, she and Duke, her loyal Rottweiler, were enjoying their daily walk. The peaceful rhythm of their stroll was a calm before the storm, one they could never have anticipated. Eleanor had lived in the town for over 40 years. She knew the faces of the neighbors, the rhythms of life here. But today, something felt different. The truck had slowed down behind her, a faint hum of the engine that seemed too persistent. Eleanor's intuition kicked in. She turned to see the four men, leaning out the windows, laughing, a cold, mocking laugh. "Nice dog," one shouted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Eleanor's pace didn't falter, but Duke's growl was enough to make her hand tighten around his leash. "Nice jewelry you got there," another man added, his voice dark with ill intent as he nodded toward the locket Eleanor wore. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened, but she remained composed. She'd been in uncomfortable situations before, had felt eyes burn through her skin with judgments and whispers. But today, she wasn't about to give in. She didn't respond, her voice steady as she said, "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" Her words felt like a shield, one she had used time and time again to protect herself from the ugliness in the world. But today, things would be different. The truck came to a stop. The men climbed out, surrounding her. The tall one stepped closer, his grin widening. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, as the others flanked him. Eleanor could feel their presence pressing against her, but she stood tall, unfazed. One of the men sneered at her necklace, his eyes narrowing as he made his move to close the space between them. Duke's growl intensified. Eleanor didn't flinch. "I'm just taking a walk," she said, her voice cool, but it was clear they weren't going to let her go. The tallest man moved in closer, blocking her path. "You picked the wrong woman to mess with," Eleanor said, her voice hardening. The tension thickened. The men were cocky, arrogant, thinking she was just another woman to intimidate, another victim who wouldn't dare stand her ground. "You want to take my necklace? Go ahead," Eleanor said, her tone steely, her body braced. She wasn't going to let them get what they wanted. She wasn't going to show fear. One of them tried to grab Duke's leash, but Duke spun around, teeth bared just inches from his hand. The man recoiled, stumbling back into his friends. Eleanor's calm voice rang out. "For grown men, and you can't even handle one old lady and her dog?" The group was on the verge of losing control, and Eleanor could sense it. The men were flustered now, the once unshakable confidence beginning to falter as Duke, a fierce and loyal protector, stood by her side. They were about to push too far, but as the men argued amongst themselves, a distant siren grew louder. A sense of dread filled the air as their faces shifted, panic creeping in. "You didn't think anyone would care, did you?" Eleanor's words hit like a slap. The men froze, the reality of their miscalculation crashing over them. The sirens grew louder still. "Looks like you made a mistake," Eleanor said softly, almost to herself. But it was enough. The sirens had arrived, and soon the men would understand that their choices would have consequences. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Eleanor could feel it, the tension that coiled around her like a snake ready to strike. Her grip on Duke's leash tightened, her knuckles pale under the pressure. He sensed it too, his muscles rippling beneath his glossy coat, his body as taut as a bowstring. Eleanor didn't need to look at him to know that he was ready, and she knew she would need him more than ever in the coming moments. She held her ground as the men closed in, their jeers and insults echoing in her ears like a dull hum. Each one of them, young, cocky, and far too sure of themselves. They were used to getting their way, but they had made one fatal mistake, underestimating her. The man closest to her, the tallest one, smirked, taking another step forward. His confidence was a shield he wore as if it was invincible. "You really think your dog's gonna save you, huh?" His voice dripped with mockery. Eleanor met his gaze, unflinching. She felt a cool calm wash over her, a reminder of all the time she'd had to hold her head high, when the world tried to knock her down. The weight of history, of the unspoken struggle she carried in her bones, steadied her. She wasn't just an old woman taking a walk with her dog. She was more than that. She had lived through things these men could never understand. Her voice was soft, but carried a weight that made the air around her seem to thicken. "My dog's not the one you need to worry about." She gave Duke a silent command, and he moved closer, his low growl a warning. The men hesitated for a split second, but it was enough. Eleanor took that moment to step back, keeping Duke in line, keeping him close. She wasn't backing down, not now. "You've made a mistake," she said, her voice as steady as a rock. "And if you don't walk away, you'll regret it." The tallest man scoffed, clearly not used to anyone challenging him. "What are you going to do about it, old lady?" "Don't make me show you," she replied, her tone ice cold. The other men chuckled, but their laughter faltered when Duke stepped forward, his growl deepening. Eleanor had been calm for so long, but something in her snapped when she saw them inching closer, intent on causing harm. "You think you're untouchable?" she asked, her words sharp and deliberate. "Well, let me tell you something. You're not." Her defiance was like a spark in dry tinder, and for the first time, the men faltered. But it wasn't enough to stop them. One of them lunged forward, tried to grab Duke's leash. That's when Duke acted, in one fluid motion. The Rottweiler snapped at the man's hand, his powerful jaws just inches from making contact. The man recoiled, fear flashing across his face. The rest of the group hesitated, but Eleanor wasn't waiting for them to decide. She was done. The warning had been clear, and now she would make sure they knew they were messing with the wrong woman. "This is your last chance," she said, her voice firm. The air between Eleanor and the men was thick with tension, each second stretching longer than the last. The tallest of the group, the one who had been so sure of his power moments ago, now seemed to waver, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. He wasn't ready to admit he had underestimated the old woman and her dog. "You really think you can talk to us like that?" he growled, taking another threatening step toward Eleanor. His hands were still clenched into fists, but the uncertainty was there now, evident in his stance. Eleanor could see in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. She knew this was a moment, the one where they would decide if they would truly push her. Eleanor took a steady breath, refusing to let fear enter her mind. She had seen much worse than this. She had lived through things these men couldn't even begin to understand. She stood tall, her back straight as an oak tree, and looked the man in the eyes, unwavering. "4 of you, and you can't even handle one woman and her dog?" Her voice was calm, almost playful, but her words cut deep. Duke barked again, a fierce and powerful sound that shook the air. The men flinched, their faces tightening in fear. The tallest man's bravado faltered for a moment, but then he squared his shoulders, his pride not allowing him to back down. "You think we're scared of a dog?" he spat, trying to reassert his dominance. "Let's see how brave you are when I—" Before he could finish, Duke lunged, his powerful muscles coiling and releasing like a spring. The man stumbled back in sheer panic, his hand flailing as he tried to regain control, but was too late. Duke's growl echoed to the street as he stood firm, the leash taut in Eleanor's hand. The other men hesitated, some glancing nervously at each other, unsure if they want to continue down this path. But the tallest man wasn't ready to back down yet. His voice, though trembling slightly, came out with all the venom he could muster. "We're not scared of you," he yelled. Eleanor's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Then why are you still standing here?" she asked, her tone sharp as a blade. Just as the standoff seemed ready to erupt into chaos, a distant sound broke the silence. Sirens. The unmistakable wail of police sirens drew closer. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't show it. She had no idea how long it would take the police to get here, but the fear in the men's eyes was enough to know that they were no longer in control of the situation. "You don't want to find out what happens next," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying more weight than she knew. The men's faces paled as the sound of the sirens grew louder, and for the first time, they seemed to lose their grip on the situation. The tallest man exchanged nervous glances with his friends, and for the briefest of moments, Eleanor saw the panic in his eyes. The illusion of power was slipping away. "You better leave," Eleanor warned, her voice now an icy command. The men stood still for a moment, uncertainty clouding their minds. But then, without another word, they turned and ran. In seconds, they were back in their truck, the tires screeching as they sped off, leaving Eleanor standing tall and victorious. As she stood there, the weight of the confrontation lifted from her chest, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. Duke's growl softened, and he relaxed by her side. Eleanor gave him a pat on the head. "Good boy," she murmured. The sirens were almost upon them now, but Eleanor didn't need their help. The message had been sent. No one would mess with Eleanor Davis, especially not on her own street. As the truck's taillights disappeared around the corner, the air seemed to grow lighter. Eleanor stood still for a moment, listening to the fading hum of the engine, her heart still pounding in her chest. Duke stood by her side, alert, but now more relaxed, his tongue hanging out as he wagged his tail. Eleanor bent down to scratch behind his ears. "You did good, boy," she murmured, her voice soft but full of pride. But she knew this moment wasn't over. The tension in the air hadn't fully dissipated, and the victory was bittersweet. She couldn't just walk away and pretend that nothing had happened. The threat wasn't gone. It never would be in a town like this. She had lived here for decades, long enough to know the unspoken prejudices that lingered just below the surface, simmering in places like the suburban neighborhood. As she straightened, ready to continue her walk, the distant sound of sirens became louder, and soon 2 squad cars screeched to a halt in front of her. Officers Carter and Lee stepped out, their eyes scanning the area before settling on Eleanor. They knew her well. She had lived here for 40 years, a pillar of the community. Yet, in this moment, she was something far more than just another neighbor. "Ma'am, you okay?" Officer Carter asked, his tone a mix of concern and professionalism. "I'm fine," Eleanor replied coolly, straightening her sun hat and adjusting the leash. She knew what he was asking, and it was no longer about whether she was physically okay. It was about what had happened here, what had almost happened. "I saw them run off," Officer Lee added, looking down the street at the distant truck. "Do you want to press charges?" Eleanor paused for a moment, her eyes flicking to the spot where the truck had vanished. She felt a stir in her chest, but it wasn't anger that bubbled up. It was clarity. She confronted the men head-on, and in doing so, had proven something to herself and the people watching. She wasn't some helpless old woman, easy to push around. And Duke. Well, Duke had been the kind of hero she hadn't expected. "No, not yet," she said, shaking her head slightly. "But I will if they come back. I don't care what they think or what they say. This isn't about me. It's about what's right. They need to know that it's not okay to treat anyone like that, no matter who they are or where they're from." Officer Carter raised an eyebrow. "So what now?" Eleanor looked at Duke, his eyes full of trust as he sat at her feet. "Now we go home, and we make sure it doesn't happen again." As she turned to leave, Eleanor could feel a weight lifting off her shoulders, but also a quiet resolve settling in her chest. She had been tested today, and she had passed. But she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The kind of hate that had manifested in those men's actions wouldn't disappear just because they ran off. It would take more than a few words or a dog to fix the deeper issues that haunted this town. But for now, Eleanor and Duke walked home, their pace steady, and the sun dipped lower behind them, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. She could feel the change in the air, like something had shifted, even if just a little. And that was enough for now. The following day, Eleanor stood before the mirror, adjusting the collar of her favorite floral dress. It was a soft lavender, one of the few things she had treated herself to after Samuel had passed. As she fastened her silver bracelet, the weight of the memory of her late husband settled in. Samuel had always been a voice of calm in moments of chaos, but now, it was Eleanor who was standing firm, ready to face whatever came next. She had been to the park with Duke again that morning, just as she did every day. But today felt different. The calm of the previous day had slipped into something more pressing. The men who had threatened her were still out there, still a looming presence in her mind. But she knew one thing. She wasn't backing down. and she wasn't about to let them get away with it. Officer Carter had called earlier that morning, asking her to meet him at the police station. "We need you to come in for a statement, Mrs. Davis," he'd said, his voice a blend of professionalism and concern. She had agreed without hesitation, knowing that this was the next step in making sure the events of the day before didn't go unpunished. As she walked into the police station, the bustle of activity felt surreal. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, and the clatter of keyboards and the murmur of officers filing reports filled the air. But Eleanor wasn't concerned about the noise or the chaos. She had been to this place a few times over the years, but never with the purpose she had now. Mrs. Davis. Officer Carter greeted her with a nod as he led her down a narrow hallway. "We're getting things together for the investigation. Just wanted to go over your statement with you." Eleanor nodded, her fingers tightly gripping the strap of her purse. "I've told you everything, officer. I don't need to repeat myself." "I know, but there's something else I need to ask," Carter continued. "We've been able to identify one of the men. His name is Brian Tanner. He's already got a record. We're still tracking down the other three, but we got a solid case against him." Eleanor's breath hitched at the mention of Brian Tanner's name, the man who had been the loudest, the most aggressive. She felt a pang of anger rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. It wasn't time for anger. It was time for justice. "Good," she said, her voice firm. "But I want to make sure they all pay. No one gets to act like that and think there will be no consequences." Officer Carter smiled, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Don't worry. We're not letting this slip through the cracks. You've got the law on your side, Mrs. Davis. You're doing the right thing." As she sat down in the small interrogation room, Eleanor found herself staring at the small recording device in front of her. She wasn't nervous. She had done the hard part. She had faced down the men who thought they could intimidate her. Now, all she had to do was speak the truth. "Let's get this over with," Eleanor said, her voice steady. The interview began, but for once, she wasn't worried. She was ready. Days passed, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching her wherever she went. The neighborhood, once a calm, familiar place, felt different now. She walked Duke with a quiet but steadfast determination, her posture still strong but her senses heightened. The men who had threatened her hadn't been caught yet, but the wheels of justice were turning. At least that's what she kept telling herself. The news reports had covered the story of the attempted robbery, but nothing was as satisfying as knowing that they couldn't erase the events from Eleanor's memory. She had become a symbol, one that spoke of courage and strength, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated or pushed aside. The community was buzzing with conversation. People who had previously turned a blind eye to injustice were now stepping forward, offering support. But there was more to be done. That afternoon, Eleanor was sitting on her porch when Officer Carter arrived at her house. He was carrying a manila folder, his usual professional demeanor mixed with a subtle air of excitement. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. It had been days since the last update, and she was anxious to hear what had happened with the investigation. "Mrs. Davis," Officer Carter greeted her, smiling warmly. "I've got good news." She stood up, brushing off her slacks. "Tell me everything." "We've identified the second man. His name is Michael Lewis. He's been in and out of trouble for years. We tracked him down to a relative's house. We have enough evidence to charge him alongside Tanner." Carter paused for a moment, allowing the weight of the news to settle in. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "And the other two?" "We're still working on that," Carter replied. "But we're making progress. We got a clear line on the others now, thanks to the footage and the statements we've gathered." Eleanor's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the battle wasn't over yet. "I want to see this through, officer. I want to make sure those men never think they can get away with something like that again." Officer Carter's eyes softened. "And we will, Mrs. Davis. The wheels of justice are turning. You've been an incredible help to this case, and your bravery is what's making all the difference." Eleanor gave him a small nod, feeling the weight of his words. It wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everyone who had been pushed down and ignored for too long. As the officer left, Eleanor felt a familiar tug on her leash. Duke looked up at her, his eyes full of loyalty and affection. She patted him gently on the head. "We're getting closer, boy. We're almost there." The tension was building, but Eleanor knew that with every step, she was moving closer to the justice she'd fought so hard for. The fight wasn't over, but she had her eyes set on victory, and no one was going to stop her. The autumn air had grown cooler, with the wind carrying the scent of distant rain. Eleanor adjusted her coat, a calm confidence settling over her as she walked Duke along the park's winding path. The street seemed quieter now, the neighborhood a little more watchful, as though everyone had become aware of the injustice that had unfolded on their doorstep. It was a place where things like this were supposed to stay out of sight, but not anymore. Duke, ever loyal, trotted by her side, his leash firm in her hand, the weight of his presence a comfort. Her heart was still heavy from the emotional toll of the past week, but today felt different. The air held a sharp promise, like the world was on the brink of something big, something final. Eleanor had been to the police station several times, each visit bringing her closer to the truth. But today was different. As they rounded the bend by the pond, Eleanor's eyes caught sight of a familiar face. Mick Lewis, the man who'd been involved in the failed robbery attempt, just days before stood across the park, his back turned to her. A hoodie obscured his face, but the unmistakable posture and the shifty look in his eyes made her pulse race. He didn't notice her immediately, but Eleanor's instincts kicked in. "Stay close, Duke," she whispered, tightening her grip on the leash. Her heart thudded in her chest, the sense of urgency sharpening. Mick had been released on bail a few hours ago, but she hadn't expected to find him here. Alone. Now was her chance. Duke's ears perked up as if sensing her growing tension. The dog trotted ahead, his movement swift but silent, ready for action. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the leash, the cold steel of her resolve matching the chill in the air. She walked slowly, her eyes fixed on Mick, who had started to glance over his shoulder. His gaze flickered nervously as he noticed her approach. He froze, his eyes widening slightly. "Thought you could lay low, huh?" Eleanor said, her voice calm, but there was a steel edge to it. "Not today." Mick's expression faltered, and he turned to flee, breaking into a jog toward the trees. Without thinking, Eleanor stepped forward. "Duke!" she called firmly, her voice commanding. The Rottweiler surged forward, his speed astonishing as he closed the distance between himself and Mick in seconds. The man glanced back in horror as Duke barreled toward him, but it was too late. The dog caught his ankle, yanking him to the ground with force that left Mick scrambling and cursing. Eleanor arrived just as Mick floundered, desperately trying to free himself from Duke's hold. She knelt beside him, looking him directly in the eye, her expression unwavering. "Did you think you could just run?" she asked, her voice a calm contrast to the chaos around them. "You thought no one would care. But you're wrong," Mick stammered, looking up at her with fear now clouding his face. "I didn't mean. I just wanted to lay low. It wasn't supposed to go this far." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "It's too late for excuses, Mick. You and your friends made your choice. Now you'll face the consequences." As the police sirens neared, Eleanor held Duke's leash firmly, the dog still on alert but now calm beside her. Mick trembled as the officers arrived, securing him with handcuffs. One of the officers nodded to Eleanor. "Nice work," he said, as Mick was led toward the squad car. Eleanor watched him being taken away, her jaw clenched, but a small sense of satisfaction settled within her. It was a turning point, a moment of reclaiming her power, a moment where the community could see what standing up truly meant. Duke nudged her hand gently, as though asking if she was all right. She smiled softly at him, scratching behind his ears. "We did it, boy," she murmured. "It's over." But even as she walked away, the shadows of the past few days still clung to her, reminding her that the fight wasn't truly finished yet. Mick was only one part of the puzzle, and the true battle was yet to be won. Still, she had taken a step forward, and she was ready for whatever came next. Eleanor Davis stood tall in the courtroom, the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but not breaking her resolve. The air was thick with tension, the room buzzing with anticipation as the final pieces of the puzzle slid into place. Mick Lewis sat across from her at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor now shattered, replaced by a mix of anxiety and defiance. The jury was watching closely, the whole room waiting for the final blow to land. She glanced at her lawyer, Jessica Nguyen, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. It had been weeks of preparation, countless hours spent gathering evidence, piecing together the testimonies, and fighting the uphill battle against the odds. But now, as the trial neared its conclusion, Eleanor felt a deep sense of purpose. She wasn't just here to bring justice for herself. She was here for everyone who had been targeted, dismissed, or silenced. The courtroom was packed, the spectators leaning forward in their seats, whispering amongst themselves. The judge, a stern middle-aged woman, raised her gavel, signaling the start of the final session. "Mrs. Davis," Judge Reynolds said, her voice firm but respectful. "Please take the stand." Eleanor stood, her heart beating steadily in her chest, as she made her way to the witness box. The polish with the stand felt cold beneath her hands as she gripped it, but the coolness did nothing to dampen her fire. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, each one waiting for her story. The last few days had been a blur, but now it was all coming together. She recounted the events of that fateful afternoon, how she and Duke had taken their regular walk through the neighborhood, how the men in the truck had targeted her, the cruel words they had thrown at her, and the escalating threats that had followed. Her voice didn't waver as she described how Duke had stepped in to protect her, his loyalty unwavering. She didn't embellish. The truth, as it always did, spoke for itself. But then came the moment she had been waiting for. "And you're certain," Jessica asked, her voice steady, "that Mick Lewis was involved in the robbery attempt?" Eleanor's gaze never left Mick, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He was the driver," Eleanor said, her voice ice cold. "He was complicit, just like the others. They thought they could take something from me, because I was alone, because they thought no one would care." The room fell silent. Mick's face flushed crimson, his earlier bravado disappearing as he struggled to meet her eyes. The evidence was inescapable now. His guilt was clear. Eleanor sat down, feeling the weight of the room's collective gaze on her. Jessica leaned in, whispering words of gratitude and pride as they prepared for the closing arguments. But Eleanor wasn't thinking about winning. She was thinking about what had brought her here, a deep-rooted desire to stand up, to not let them get away with it. The judge called for a short recess, and as the courtroom emptied briefly, Eleanor caught sight of the community members who had rallied behind her. The support she felt from the crowd was overwhelming. People had come to understand that her battle wasn't just hers. It was theirs too. When the trial resumed, it was time for the closing arguments. The defense attempted to downplay Mick's actions, claiming he was just following orders, that he wasn't the one who had escalated things. But the prosecution, led by Jessica, dismantled every excuse, every weak argument the defense had thrown. As the jury deliberated, Eleanor remained poised. She didn't let herself hope for too much, knowing that whatever happened next would be the culmination of everything she had fought for. Then, the door to the courtroom swung open. The jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson stood, her hand shaking slightly as she read the verdict aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant Mick Lewis guilty of assault, conspiracy to commit robbery, and unlawful intimidation." Eleanor's heart leapt. A wave of relief washed over her, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. Mick sat, stunned, his head hanging as the weight of the verdict sank in. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but Eleanor's focus remained unshaken. She had fought for what was right, and now justice had been served. As the men were led away in handcuffs, Eleanor turned to Duke, who sat at her feet, his eyes bright and proud. She bent down, petting him affectionately. "You did it, boy," she whispered. "We did it." Justice had been served, but this was just the beginning. The battle for accountability, for a society where no one was dismissed or judged based on the color of their skin or their age, was far from over. But Eleanor knew she had just taken the first step toward a future where people like her no longer had to be afraid. She walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, Duke at her side, ready for whatever came next. The courtroom buzzed as a judge, a no-nonsense woman in her early 50s, hammered her gavel, silencing the room. Eleanor Davis sat still, her hands clasped in her lap, her heart pounding. She had come a long way from that terrifying day when 4 men thought they could intimidate her. She had stood firm, with Duke by her side, and now, as the final moment of the trial approached, she felt a deep sense of resolve. The verdict had been delivered. Mick Lewis was guilty. The other men involved had been apprehended, and the town was slowly beginning to understand the gravity of what had occurred. But this wasn't just about them. This was about something much bigger, something far more profound. Eleanor's thoughts wandered to the quiet strength she had discovered within herself. It was one thing to stand up when you knew you were right, but it was another to stay strong when the weight of fear and doubt threatened to crush you. She had chosen to face her attackers, to fight not just for herself but for the people who would come after her, those who might find themselves in the same position. And though it had been a long, difficult journey, she had emerged stronger, ready to take on whatever the world had in store for her. As she looked around the courtroom, she noticed the faces of those who had supported her, friends, community members, even strangers who had come to witness the trial. They were all standing together, a testament to the power of unity. Eleanor realized that the true victory wasn't in the guilty verdict. It was in the way the community had rallied around her. It was in the way her story had inspired others to speak out, to stand up against injustice. And, most importantly, it was in the way they had learned the most vital lesson of all, that silence in the face of wrongdoing is as harmful as the wrongdoing itself. After the trial, as Eleanor left the courthouse with Duke trotting beside her, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She knew there was still much work to be done, that there would always be challenges to face. But for the first time in years, she felt that the world was a little bit safer for people like her. She had faced fear head-on, and in doing so, had carved a path for others to follow. As she glanced down at Duke, who looked up at her with adoration, Eleanor smiled. "We did it, boy," she whispered. "And this is just the beginning." The lessons of that day stayed with her long after she returned home. Lessons of courage, of standing up for what is right, and of never underestimating the power of one determined voice. The days following the trial were a blur for Eleanor Davis. The weight of everything that had happened, her encounter with the 4 men, the trial, the support from the community, had settled deep within her, like an anchor that kept her grounded even in the midst of uncertainty. Yet, as the dust began to settle, Eleanor realized that the real work was just beginning. The town, once a place where whispers and judgments ran deep, had started to shift. People who had previously kept their heads down now spoke up. Community meetings were organized, and discussions on accountability, justice, and equality began to surface. Eleanor was no longer just a woman who had been attacked in the street. She was now a symbol of what one voice, one person, could accomplish when they refused to back down. The transformation was slow, but it was undeniable. Local schools introduced programs focused on empathy and inclusivity. The police department, which had once turned a blind eye to the small injustices of the town, began to implement new training initiatives to address bias and community trust. And while Eleanor's name was now associated with the trial, she felt a greater sense of pride in the changes unfolding around her. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table one evening, sipping her tea, Duke curled at her feet. She thought back on the days she had stood up to those men, her calm but firm words, her unwavering stance. She realized now that what had made her so strong wasn't just her defiance. It was a belief that what was right could always be more powerful than what was easy. Her thoughts turned to the young man who had recorded the incident. She'd never caught his name, but he had spoken the truth that day when he said, "This isn't just about her. It's about all of us." Eleanor had come to understand that, in many ways, his words had been the catalyst for what happened next. People had seen her strength, yes, but they had also seen their own power reflected in her. The lesson that stayed with her, however, was simple but profound. Change begins with courage. Eleanor stood up and walked to a window, gazing out over the quiet suburban street. The sun had set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. She could see people moving about, neighbors chatting in their yards, children playing in the street. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt that the world had become a little bit kinder, a little bit fairer. "Duke," she said softly, as her dog stirred beside her, "I think we've done good work here." Duke wagged his tail, his loyal eyes meeting hers. They had faced a storm together, and now, as they moved forward, Eleanor knew that their fight for justice had sparked something much larger than they could have ever imagined. And as she took Duke out for another evening walk, she realized that no matter the obstacles ahead, they were ready. The world had changed, and Eleanor Davis had been part of that change. One step, one word, one courageous stand at a time.